In 1945, the United States built the smartest bomb in the world, a weapon so advanced it could find its own target and adjust its own flight. It was designed to be the ultimate soldier, no fear, no hesitation, and absolutely no need for a pilot to guide it. There was only one slight problem with this technological marvel: it couldn't actually explode when it was supposed to. It was the Bat, the wonder child of American science, a guided weapon that promised to change warfare forever but mostly just confused the fish. The Navy claimed this sophisticated tube of electronics could see through clouds, storms, and darkness, acting like a flying brain that hunted ships independently. It was supposed to end the war without mistakes, without mercy, and most importantly, without the messy involvement of human beings. By 1945, the United States had started to believe a very dangerous idea: that machines, unlike men, were incapable of failure. Propaganda posters shouted this lie from every wall, engineers promised it in every meeting, and generals desperately wanted to believe it to sleep better at night. America in 1944 wasn't just fighting the Empire of Japan, it was fighting the concept of imperfection itself. The entire nation had transformed into one vast laboratory of control, obsessed with replacing human error with mechanical certainty. Bell Labs was busy building radar brains that hummed with electricity, while RCA was wiring new guidance systems that looked like the insides of a chaotic radio. In New Jersey, young women soldered radio circuits that would blindly decide matters of life and death an ocean away. The plan was terrifyingly simple: if humans are unpredictable and prone to emotions like doubt, just replace them. The machine would think, act, and kill with scientific precision, turning the chaos of battle into a neat and tidy equation. The weapon of the future was finally ready, sitting on the tarmac and looking smarter than the people who built it. But as we all know, the future has a nasty habit of arriving before the bugs have been fixed. On April 1, 1945, the skies over the Philippines became the stage for the first real test of this mechanical genius. A Navy bomber took off carrying the first Bat bomb under its wing, the crew looking at it with a mix of awe and suspicion. They had been told the bomb would fly itself, which sounds great until you realize you're strapped to a robot that hasn't passed its driving test. Just drop it and watch, the engineers said, it's foolproof, which is usually the last thing you hear before a disaster. At 8:47 a.m., the bombardier released the weapon, and for a brief, shining moment, the future looked bright. The radar activated, the wings adjusted, and the bomb dipped and turned toward a Japanese frigate cutting through the waves. It looked perfect, a triumph of American engineering swooping down to deliver mechanized justice. But then, reality intervened, the signal vanished, the brain went dead, and the Bat decided to become a submarine instead. It tilted, spiraled, and performed a graceful dive straight into the ocean, missing the target by a humiliating distance. There was no explosion, no splash of victory, just a few seconds of awkward silence before the sea swallowed another $20,000 experiment. The Navy's official reports called the test unsatisfactory but promising, which is code for it failed completely, but we spent too much money to admit it. Bell Labs called it technically sound with operational limitations, meaning the bomb worked great, provided there was no weather, water, or enemies. And the factories? They didn't call it anything, they just kept producing them because stopping the assembly line was considered unpatriotic. When America's machines failed, the solution was never to stop and think, the solution was always the same: build more of them. So they did exactly what any rational bureaucracy would do: they ignored the failure and built 3,000 more of them. These weapons rolled off the assembly lines looking terrifying, weapons that couldn't win a single fight but looked absolutely fantastic in a quarterly budget report. It was faith disguised as efficiency, a belief system where output is more important than outcome. And let me tell you, faith is a dangerous thing in the hands of engineers who think they can mathematically prove God exists. The Bat didn't die because it was stupid, the machine did exactly what its circuits told it to do. It died because the people who built it believed they were too smart to fail, convinced that the chaos of the world would politely step aside for their invention. But nature is an indifferent beast. Rain confused the radar, turning the bomb's sophisticated brain into a panic attack. Tropical heat warped the delicate sensors, and the sea created clutter that the engineers back in cool, dry New Jersey hadn't accounted for. That endless, indifferent machine of nature swallowed the logic of men whole, proving that a PhD in physics is useless against a heavy thunderstorm. The Bat's downfall wasn't a malfunction, it was a mirror reflecting the arrogance of a civilization. It showed a nation convinced that intelligence was the same as wisdom, which is like thinking that knowing how to build a Frankenstein monster means you should let it babysit your kids. When the war ended, the program disappeared overnight, swept under the rug like an embarrassing pile of dust. There were no headlines, no medals, and certainly no glory for the pilots who had risked their lives dropping glorified paperweights. Just a few thousand crates sealed in naval depots, stamped with the saddest word in the military dictionary, obsolete. But here is the secret of the military-industrial complex: failure never dies in America, it just gets rebranded with a cooler acronym. The same engineers who built the Blind Bat went on to design the first cruise missiles, early drones, and computer guidance systems. The Bat failed to hit its wooden targets in the ocean, but it hit something far more important: the future. It struck the beginning of a new kind of warfare, one where remote control mattered more than actual understanding. Today, divers still find them off the Philippine coast, gray shells lying perfectly preserved on the seabed like ancient artifacts of stupidity. They look asleep, not dead, their radar eyes still intact and staring blankly into the murky water. Their aluminum bodies are untouched by time, silent proof that technological progress doesn't always decay, sometimes it just waits for a software update. The Bat didn't explode physically, but its idea exploded culturally, infiltrating every missile and algorithm that followed. America built a bomb that couldn't think, and in the process, accidentally invented the age of thinking machines. It was the fail upward strategy perfected on a national scale. By 1942, America was no longer a country with citizens, it was a giant, angry engine that breathed steel and exhaled victory slogans. The entire nation had transformed into an industrial organism, a beast that ate raw resources and spat out tanks like they were sunflower seeds. Detroit stopped making family sedans and started building tanks that got 3 gallons to the mile, turning the Motor City into the Murder City. Pittsburgh's furnaces glowed day and night, feeding the war like a living volcano that never slept, only burped black smoke. Every bolt, screw, and drop of fuel had a specific purpose: to prove that the system worked better than fascism. At the heart of this machine was a new faith, not in God, generals, or apple pie, but in the machine itself. In the sterile corridors of Washington, a new religious creed was taking shape: if it can be built, it can be controlled. War had turned pocket protector engineers into prophets, and the blueprint became their holy scripture. The logic was intoxicatingly simple: humans make mistakes, get scared, miss lunch, and have feelings. Machines don't feel regret, don't get tired, and never ask for a raise, they just obey. The American war machine didn't just need soldiers, it needed absolute obedience. And let's be honest, nothing obeys quite like a piece of technology that doesn't have a soul to worry about. This was the moral foundation of mid-century America, the sanctification of precision. Bell Labs, the National Bureau of Standards, and MIT weren't just laboratories, they were cathedrals of calculation where math was the new liturgy. Inside, white-coated men drew the future with slide rules, arrogant enough to believe they could civilize destruction. To them, World War II wasn't a horror show, it was just a really big logistics problem waiting to be optimized. Henry Ford had already taught America that order could be mass-produced on an assembly line. By the 1940s, that lesson had migrated to the front lines, turning warfare into a manufacturing process where death was the final product. Logistics became theology: every soldier, shell, and gallon of oil was reduced to a cold number in a flowchart. In this world of perfect data, the Bat was born, the unholy offspring of a calculator and a bomb. The Navy's Bureau of Ordnance wanted a weapon that didn't need courage, conscience, or a pulse, just coordinates. Bell Labs promised to deliver it: a bomb that would remove the last unpredictable element in war, the human being. When Admiral Ralph Bowden called it the next step in modern warfare, he wasn't exaggerating, he was confessing. Because for America, technology had become a form of confession, a way to wash away the guilt of war by replacing blood with circuitry. By 1944, the line between morality and machinery had blurred so much you needed a microscope to find it. Propaganda posters showed women tightening bolts under the slogan "Victory through production," implying that if you didn't tighten that nut, Hitler would personally come to your house. Churches prayed for our scientists in service, effectively asking God to bless the bombs. In factories, foremen shouted slogans like "every screw is a bullet, every switch a life," turning mundane assembly work into a holy crusade against imperfection. The nation was no longer fighting evil with a capital E, it was manufacturing efficiency with a capital E. The concept of good was quietly taken out back and shot, replaced by the concept of effective. Success wasn't measured in justice anymore, it was measured in output per hour. The Bat bomb was the logical, cold-hearted outcome of that thinking, a weapon not guided by hate, patriotism, or strategy, but by simple signal return strength. It didn't need a pilot's instinct or a commander's judgment, it just needed electricity and a vacuum tube. Inside Bell Labs, they worked day and night under the relentless glare of fluorescent lights that hummed like a migraine. Oscilloscopes hummed, radar dishes rotated, and slide rules slid back and forth in a frantic dance of logic. Every new reading was treated like scripture from the mount. To these engineers, a failed test wasn't just a mistake, it was heresy. Each unsuccessful test only proved that the machine hadn't yet achieved its divine purpose, so they worked harder. They weren't just building a weapon, they were training a mechanical mind to see the world as a series of targets. A small group of physicists even joked that Bat was the first student who never questioned authority. It obeyed perfectly, sat still in class, and did exactly what it was told, it just happened to be completely brain-dead. But in America's wartime theology, that distinction didn't matter, obedience was progress. The problem with this kind of faith is that it spreads like a virus. If you believe machines can think, soon you'll believe they can judge. In the closing months of the war, the U.S. military doubled down, investing in radio-controlled torpedoes, acoustic mines, and proximity fuses. Each gadget promised the same seductive lie, certainty in a chaotic world. But the closer America came to perfect control, the further it drifted from reality. No machine, no algorithm, and no radar beam could truly comprehend the chaos of a battlefield, let alone the weather. Nature didn't care about blueprints, and the Pacific Ocean was nature's way of reminding engineers that the universe does not obey linear equations. Every failed drop of the Bat was not just a technical error, it was a philosophical crack in the foundation. It was a rude reminder that war is not a spreadsheet problem you can solve with a calculator. Yet, even after the war, the faith survived because admitting failure is not the American way. By mid-1945, the Pacific had become the world's most expensive testing ground, a place where millions of dollars were thrown into the water to see if they would float. Every flight was an experiment in America's war of intelligence, but unfortunately, the machines decided to play truant. At the Navy's test ranges near the Philippines, the Bat was supposed to glide toward enemy ships like a metal hawk finding its prey. On paper, it was majestic. In the air, it had the navigation skills of a moth trapped in a lamp factory. Sometimes the radar seeker locked onto the wrong reflection, waves, clouds, or awkwardly, the plane that had just dropped it. The bomb would fly in wide, confused circles, chasing its own tail while the pilots watched in embarrassment. More often than not, it simply dropped into the sea, disappearing in seconds like a grand piano thrown off a pier. The test reports were polite, using phrases like guidance irregular, but the pilots were less diplomatic. They called it the drunk pigeon, a nickname that stuck because it captured the weapon's grace perfectly. The engineers, refusing to blame their own genius, naturally blamed the Pacific Ocean for being too wet, too salty, and too alive. They complained that tropical heat warped the sensors and radar waves scattered across the water's surface, breaking their neat equations. The Bat had been designed in cool, white laboratories where chaos could be graphed, but nature refuses to fit on a clipboard. Then came the ultimate irony: the autonomous bomb still needed a human babysitter to hold its hand. Pilots had to release it at exact altitudes, and technicians had to tune radar frequencies mid-flight, frantically twisting knobs to keep the brain alive. If the machine was off by a few degrees, the whole system collapsed like a nervous soufflé. It was like watching a god that claimed to be omnipotent but couldn't tie its own shoelaces without help. Yet, the Navy kept pretending it worked, carefully editing the failures out of the propaganda reels. In the age of faith, even data needed censorship to make sure the congregation stayed happy and the funding kept flowing. Back in New Jersey, Bell Labs engineers refused to give up, acting like high priests who couldn't admit their idol was made of clay. One internal memo read, "The Bat exhibits promising adaptive potential if environmental disturbances are statistically normalized." Translated from bureaucratic nerd speak, that means, it doesn't work, but if we pretend the weather doesn't exist, it's perfect. They added circuits and recalibrated gyros, treating every tweak like a prayer, but the result was always failure with style. When the Bureau of Ordnance reviewed the numbers, they did what all great bureaucracies do, they moved the goalposts. If the bomb landed near the target, it was called effective deviation. If it didn't explode, it was data pending. As long as the reports looked promising, the system stayed alive, because stopping the assembly line would mean admitting science had failed. In wartime America, momentum was morality, and a working factory was more important than a working bomb. Only one bat ever achieved a confirmed kill, hitting a small Japanese freighter near Borneo in April 1945. The Navy celebrated it as absolute proof the system worked, ignoring the fact that it was basically a statistical accident, a fluke in a sea of failures. The engineers toasted their victory and wrote new funding proposals, while the indifferent ocean swallowed the other 2,999 failures. The Bat's biggest failure wasn't technical, it taught America that even when the data screams no, the dream can still scream yes. By the time the war ended, 3,000 Bat bombs had been completed, but only a dozen were ever used in anger. The rest sat in neat rows inside Navy warehouses, silent, perfect, and pointless, waiting for a war that didn't want them. Every one of them had passed inspection, yet every one of them had failed reality, becoming the world's most expensive collection of aluminum paperweights. When the production contracts ended, there was no funeral, the line workers went home, and the engineers simply moved on to the next obsession. In 1946, the Bat program was formally terminated with a final report that read operational potential demonstrated, which is polite bureaucrat speak for we wasted millions, but let's not talk about it. But nothing inside the system truly ends, it just gets absorbed and rebranded. Bell Labs went on to invent the transistor, the laser, and the satellite, building the digital skeleton of the modern world. The Bat bomb failed, but its logic, the desire to make thinking predictable and chaos computable, survived and spread everywhere like a technological virus. Years later, a Bell radar specialist admitted, it worked, just not in the world we live in, which is the most honest obituary a machine ever got. It was designed for a perfect world without weather or waves, and since that world doesn't exist, America decided to build bigger computers to simulate it. The Bat was buried, but its circuitry was reincarnated into the cruise missiles and heat-seeking weapons of the Cold War. The same radar logic that failed in the Pacific became the foundation for the drones that would later patrol the skies of Vietnam and the Middle East. By the 1950s, automation had become a patriotic word, synonymous with progress and control. There was no explosion when the dream of the Bat collapsed, just a quiet shift in industrial psychology where efficiency became the new morality. If a machine worked, it was good. If it failed, the answer was simply to build more of them until they worked. The Bat had no veterans to tell its story, only invoices and patent numbers, leaving behind a feeling that humanity had glimpsed a frontier that was terrifyingly empty. By the 1960s, most of the stored bombs had corroded beyond use, some were scrapped, some dumped in the ocean, and a few ended up in museums. Visitors walked past display cases reading dry technical plaques, unaware that they were looking at the ancestor of the artificial intelligence that now runs their lives. The Bat's death was not the death of a bomb, it was the death of humility. It marked the moment when technology stopped asking why, and started asking only how fast, a question we are still answering today with terrifying speed. The bomb that couldn't explode multiplied into a philosophy, that if we calculate enough, we can remove the chaos from human nature. The Bat didn't ask why the target existed, it only cared about the radar reflection, the echo that defined its purpose. That is the danger of every system built on precision, the moment it achieves control, it forgets meaning. A civilization that optimizes everything eventually optimizes itself out of purpose, leaving behind a world of perfect machines and irrelevant humans. 70 years later, the equations wear new names like AI, machine learning, and predictive systems, but it's the same prayer. We call them intelligent and neutral, but neutrality is just another word for obedience, and obedience always serves the system that built it. If the Bat could send a signal from the ocean floor today, it would be a confession that it was never alive, but somehow became immortal. It would tell us that every time we replace understanding with automation, we are repeating its doomed flight into the sea. Listen closely, not to the static of screens, but to the silence between them, that is the sound of a civilization mistaking control for wisdom. This has been Professor Archibald for the Yellow History, reminding you that the smartest bomb is the one you never have to build.